Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What's a story that you've heard that gives you chills? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. This is the story of how I came to believe in ghosts. When I was 12, my mom dragged me and my friend along with her to a haircut. We were bored and decided to take a walk down the main street we were on and window shop. Just a few stores down, there was a gap for a small parking lot. As we walked past, an elderly African-American lady waves us over to the car she's sitting in with the doors open. Being that there are two of us and that she's clearly more feeble, we go inquire what's wrong. The lady seems a little out of it and is begging us to go across the street to another salon that her daughter owns. She's having trouble getting out of the car, see, and wants her daughter's help. She just keeps repeating, even as we're walking away to begin the task, multiple renditions of "please just get my daughter" and "I'm primarily African-American hair studio." We walk over to the salon, two small, very pale girls wandering into the African-American hair studio and are greeted with odd looks and silence. We get shown to the manager. She listens to our story and goes from inquisitive to white as a sheet in all of 10 seconds. We look to one another as something is obviously wrong. She starts in on us, asking all these questions. She's starting to grow upset. When we inquire what we did wrong and why we're not going to help her mom, she tells us this. With a nauseous look and tears starting down her face, she says her mother, just a few months before, had died horribly when she got forced off a bridge and drowned when she couldn't get herself out of her car. We immediately ran back across the street. No car, no lady. Asked the lot attendant. No older lady fitting that description had come through all shifts. I never could question again. We thought it was a prank, but the daughter's reaction was too real and candid to be anything but the truth. DR. The old lady tries to get help from out of the car. It turns out the old lady had died, being unable to get out of her car. Spooky. This isn't a story I heard, but one that I experienced myself. I was 7 years old, and we, my mom and sister, moved into our new house in Florida. My father had died the year before from complications during a triple bypass. My sister and I slept upstairs. In between our rooms was a pretty open area loft. One night I woke up sometime really late, and for some reason I got up and looked across the loft toward my sister's room, and clear as day I saw a shadow in the shape of a man standing at the edge of the stairs. The house was pitch black. There were no lights to cast a shadow. Being 7 years old, I freaked the F out, thinking it was a burglar, and jumped back into bed and cried myself to sleep. I woke up a short period of time later, maybe 15 to 30 minutes. I got up and checked the stairs again, and the shadow was gone. So I grabbed my little flashlight and headed downstairs toward my mom's room. Her door was cracked a little bit, so I peeked through, and I saw a shadow figure walk around my mother's bed, then behind and bend over her. I shined my light on the floor in front of her door, and the figure, just to and upright position, and seems to look at me, then turns and walks into her bedroom. I'm an atheist, and I'm not sure if I believe in spirits, but to this day I have no explanation for what happened other than it being my father checking up on us and then bending over to kiss my mom goodbye perhaps one last time. Just recalling and typing this out sends shivers down my spine. A friend of mine lived on Long Island about 2001. Hey, I want to say Brentwood, close. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I lived in California back then and still do. I knew one woman who died on September 11th, a flight attendant on the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, but that was it. And I only barely knew her. I figured, as a New Yorker, almost, my friend probably knew more folks, or at least had a story about September 11th. I guess I had asked out of sort of morbid fascination. September 11th always seemed like a movie, even when it was happening. In my mind, it was happening on CNN, not in a real place where people lived. So when I asked, I suppose I was hoping for a story of collapsing buildings, running and panicking, and I could say, oh my God, that sounds horrible, but secretly think, it would be so cool to have been on the ground that day. How exciting. What she said wasn't exciting at all. She told me she didn't know anybody personally who had died that day and that she hadn't been in Manhattan and so on and so on. But what she did say is she went to the train station every day very early for work, far earlier than most people do, and she noticed that before September 11th there had almost never been any cars in the lot when she arrived. But afterwards there was always 6 or 7 cars, the same cars. They never moved. And every day they got more and more tickets and chalk marks on the tire until eventually the meter maids figured out who these cars belonged to and realized they would never return for them. Somehow this story of hers got to me more than any of the footage or the jumping man or any of that. It all seemed so exciting and unreal on the TV. And then here was this story without any excitement, without any screams or running or collapsing buildings or tales of heroism. Just a few cars sitting in a parking lot as silent testimonies to people who would never drive them again because they'd been murdered. Suddenly it didn't seem so exciting anymore. Seeing as how it is 9/11, this story really resonated with someone who also was living on Long Island, about 19 miles from Ground Zero that day, and hearing the jets fly by, and knew some people who didn't come home. The cars were ominous, and they were in a lot of those train stations. Never forget. There was a family who had a snake that wasn't eating. He had skipped his last few meals, which are weeks apart, and the family got worried. So they boxed the snake up and took him to the vet. The vet examined the snake and couldn't find any problem, so he began to ask the mother, "Does he stay in a cage of any sort?" The mom replied, "Yes, but we leave him out most of the time." The vet said, "Where does he sleep?" The mom replied, "In my 10-year-old daughter's room. She's very affectionate with the snake." The vet asked, "Does he sleep coiled up or stretched out?" The mom said, "Stretched out." The vet responded timidly, "I don't know how to tell you this, but he was preparing to eat your daughter. He had been fasting and stretching out near your daughter to see if he was big enough to eat her." Once upon a time, there was a man made entirely out of pillows. His body was a pillow, his head was a pillow, all his fingers were pillows, and even his toes were pillows. He was about 9 feet tall, so the Pillowman had a very sad job. He also had magical powers that gave him the ability to travel through time. His job was to travel back in time and visit children who would grow up to live horrible lives, and he would convince these children to kill themselves. Then rather than living the rest of their miserable life that he knew about in the future, the Pillowman went to visit a little girl one day who knew would grow up to have an awful life. He told her about all the horrible things that would happen to her when she grew up, but she didn't believe him. She told the Pillowman, "I'm happy, Mr. Pillowman. I've always been happy and I'll always be happy." And the Pillowman looked at this happy little girl and just knew he couldn't convince her to kill herself. He went back to her as an adult, and she asked him, "Why didn't you convince me, Mr. Pillowman? Why did you let me live this horrible life?" And the Pillowman said, "You were such a happy little girl." And she said, "But Mr. Pillowman, I've never been happy." And he watched as this grown-up slit her wrist because of all the horrible things that he could have prevented. Now the Pillowman had a very sad job because if he was successful, then a very young child would die. But if he was unsuccessful, then a little child would live and grow up in a horrible life. The Pillowman became very sad about his job, so decided to do one final job, and then that would be it. So the Pillowman went back in time for the last time, and found a little boy sitting behind a tree. He called out to the boy, "I want to talk to you, little boy." And the boy came out, but it was not a boy at all. It was the little Pillow Boy from the past. And the Pillowman told the Pillow Boy about all the awful things that he would grow up to do and the horrible job he would have. And the little boy understood instantly. He took a little tank of gasoline and poured it all over himself. Then he told the Pillowman, "Will you tell my mommy I won't be one for dinner?" And the Pillowman said yes, lying of course. The Pillow Boy struck a match and went up in flames. The Pillowman stood there fading away from reality, and the last thing he heard was the screams and cries for help from all the little children who would grow up to live horrible lives that he would never again help. The Pillowman by Martin McDonough. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all the sentence, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connected to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about the state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I've spoken with God, and he's abandoned us," and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. Story of a friend of mine. I'm on vacation in France on my own, and I decided to drink a few beers just outside of town in a nice bar. The bar was not too crowded, and it seemed not a lot of people were out on the street that day. After a nice chat with the bartender, it was getting pretty late, and I decided to head back to the hotel I was staying in. It was 2 a.m. at the time, and since I didn't feel like walking, I decided to take the metro. I got in the metro and sat down right in front of 3 people, 2 guys around 30 years old with a young girl in the middle. They said nothing. One of the guys had his arm around her, and the left guy was just smiling occasionally. The girl was just staring at me like she wanted to ask something. She looked pretty sick. It was a 5-minute ride, but after 3 minutes, a guy tapped on my shoulder and said, "You and me are getting out next stop." His voice was very serious, and immediately I felt something was wrong. I got out with him and asked him what was wrong. Then the guy responded, "Didn't you see? That girl who sat in front of you? She was dead." Gives me chills every time. Sorry for the spelling. Dutch. This happened several years ago when I was 19. It was sometime during the summer, probably in June. I was staying with my best friend. She lived with her grandparents, and at about 11 p.m. we decided we would drive down to see some friends in Tulsa, which is about 4 hours away from where we are in KC. Never mind the fact that we would be arriving around 3 a.m. It was the weekend, so no doubt our friend would be up partying at that time. So we got some snacks and hit the road. Now, we had driven to Tulsa many times over the years, but the only route we knew was Route 69, which is the little 2-lane highway. We would have preferred to take the interstate since it was nighttime. We'd only ever made the drive during the day, but we couldn't find a map. Our grandparents didn't have internet access, and this was just before the days of GPS, so we had to take the route we knew. Route 69 between KC and Tulsa basically goes through the middle of nowhere. The entire drive, you're passing through cornfields or the woods. There are no lights but your headlights at night, and no cell phone service the entire way. At least this is how it was then. I haven't driven that road since that night. Basically, we were banking on a smooth journey the whole way, or we'd be totally effed. We had no idea when we left just how badly things could potentially turn out. We were having a great time listening to the radio, eating our snacks, and windows down. We were about halfway there when things started to get weird. Remember, this is a 4-hour trip, so we were 2 hours into the middle of nowhere with no cell service, and we were approaching the point of no return. We had just enough gas to either get us there or back home, so we had to either go the whole way or turn around. At this point, there were also woods on either side of us, starting just a few yards from the road on each side. Then the weirdness began. We noticed some blood on the road in the other lane. No big deal, we figured someone must have hit a deer, which is very common in that area. But as we kept driving, there was more blood, and more blood, and more blood. Over the course of 10 miles or so, the amount of blood on the road grew from a small splattering to a massive pool, covering about 3 car lengths, still the other lane, running off into the woods. This is when we start to realize that something isn't right. Not only was it an extremely large amount of blood, more than there could ever possibly be just from hitting a deer, but that's all there was, just blood. There were no animal parts of any kind, not even random chunks of fur, no broken glass or other car wreckage, nothing. Just a massive amount of blood on the road. We also realized that we hadn't passed a single other car the entire time, and considering that the blood was on the other side of the road, if someone had hit an animal, and their car was still drivable, it would have passed us a while back. Not only that, but the blood was very, very fresh. Whatever had happened within the last couple of hours at the most. Naturally, we were starting to freak out. Neither one of us is the type to panic or assume the worst, but we'd seen a lot of horror movies, and I'm sure that you are all aware of how a lot of horror movies start. Something just felt really, really off. 2. Even before we realized there was something beyond roadkill happening, we both got a gut feeling that something was very wrong. Anyway, like I said, before we had pretty much reached the point of no return, we had to decide whether to turn around and go home or keep driving, and we had to decide quickly. Well, that decision was made for us. Suddenly, we arrived at a roadblock. I literally had to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting it. Things felt even weirder. For one thing, there were no previous signs warning that the road was going to be closed. Second, they barely looked authentic. They were old, the white and orange striped sawhorse kind, and the wood was rotting. You could hardly make out the letters and the words road closed, and finally there wasn't any sort of detour. Or so we thought. After sitting there for a minute trying to make any sense of what was going on, nearing a state of panic, we realized that there was a detour. Off to the side of the road, there was a small homemade crooked-edged sign with the word detour, yes, spelled that way, painted on it, in dripping red letters. Seriously, see what I mean about the cheesy details? I would have come up with something better had I made this up, but that's just what happened. The sign pointed to a narrow, overgrown, obviously rarely used dirt road that led off into the pitch-black woods, and as far as we could see, it led away from the direction of the highway. This was when we decided, obviously, that we were getting the hell out of there. And I don't know what possessed us to do this, but we decided to switch drivers. We both got out of the car and ran to switch, and as we got back into the car, the windows were still down. We definitely heard some voices and movement in the woods, very close to the edge on both sides of the road. My friend was now driving, and she took off as fast as my crappy little car could go. We didn't look back. We just kept driving until we were back to civilization. To this day, we have no idea what really happened in the woods that night. When we got back to her grandparents' house, we just snuck in and eventually went to sleep. Thank God whoever or whatever was out there wasn't a little better at whatever the hell they were doing. Road spikes to puncture tires, anyone? They must have been new at the whole psycho killer game. Because I really feel like we very, very narrowly escaped getting Texas or Kansas chainsaw massacred out there. This one will sort of lift your spirits. My neighbor is retired FDNY ex-Marine, injured in 9/11. He told us this crazy story about a mob hit that he responded to. It was the night before Thanksgiving, and they responded to an apartment fire. The fire was deemed unsafe to attempt a search and rescue, so they doused it and went in to inspect the building. They identified the source of the fire, which was an apartment doused in accelerant. In the center of the living room, two bodies, presumably a couple, were stacked on top of one another. They were shot execution style and then burned. My neighbor continues to inspect the apartment for more victims, and unfortunately he finds another tiny corpse in the kitchen sink, presumably the child of the couple, burnt beyond recognition. He loses his composure and books it outside to vomit. What kind of person murders a kid like that? He regains his composure and steps back inside, where his chief is updating the police on the situation. He hears, "The two victims were shot," and he interrupts, "Three. There were 3 victims. You missed the child in the kitchen sink." He kind of choked up at this point. Silence. The EMT walks over to the sink and lets out a nervous chuckle. "Charlie, you idiot, you almost gave us a heart attack. It's Thanksgiving. That's the fucking turkey, you jackass."